Alice Guy-Blaché is a name you're probably not familiar with. I know I wasn't until a few years ago. So, who is she? Well, Alice Guy was the first female director in the world, and from 1895 to 1906, she was the only female director in the world. Alice Guy literally witnessed the birth of cinema. She worked with and knew the various inventors racing towards inventing the first motion picture camera. She was present when the Lumiere brothers gave their first screening to demonstrate their new invention, the cinematography, which was the first successful motion picture camera. She became a successful filmmaker in her own right and was made the head of production at her employer's studio when she was 23 years old. She's one of the first filmmakers to adopt narrative filmmaking, to use close-up shots, and she made thousands of films and made hundreds of sound films at a time when sound films allegedly did not exist. She was in America when the film industry was beginning to develop in New York, and when the industry abandoned New York and moved to Los Angeles, California. She had her own production company and had her own studio plant, and ushered in new talent and supervised many aspiring filmmakers, some of whom went on to have very successful film careers. Alice Guy-Blaché is a pretty fucking cool woman. She is also massively under-recognized, underappreciated, and unknown. For almost 3 decades, Alice Guy-Blaché made thousands of films, but her films were lost and or destroyed, and her name vanished with them. She isn't taught in film schools, and is hardly mentioned when discussing cinema's history, especially early cinema's history. As Pamela B. Green said, anytime you mention early cinema, she has to be mentioned. If you talk about Hollywood before Hollywood, she has to be mentioned. If you talk about an artist and an entrepreneur at the time, she has to be mentioned. When she's born, celluloid is registered. She grows up with photography and she meets the beginning of cinema face to face. Her story goes hand in hand with film. It's like her destiny. It is thanks to film scholars and historians Anthony Slide and Alison McMahan and filmmakers Pamela B. Green and Marquise Lee Page that we know what we do know about Alice Guy-Blaché, and that some of her films were found and can be watched today. And it is their work I will be citing and referencing throughout this video, especially Alison McMahan's book, Alice Guy-Blaché, Lost Visionary of Cinema. In this video, we're going to dive deep into all things Alice Guy-Blaché. We're going to dive deep into her career, how technology played a part in her personal life, how her husband did and did not affect her career. We're going to talk about a number of her films, but not all of them. It's really hard to talk about 100 plus films in a video. And we're going to talk about her sound films. We will also discuss the filmmaking techniques she discovered with friends and used, and we will talk about the end of her career and why her work was lost or destroyed, and why Alice Guy-Blaché was forgotten. I have made a playlist with every Alice Guy-Blaché film I could find on YouTube, so if you would like to watch her films, and I recommend you do, the playlist will be linked in the description. Before we begin, I would just like to make a note that throughout this video I'm going to refer to Alice Guy-Blaché by her maiden name, Guy, to avoid confusing her narrative with her husband's, Herbert Blaché, who, as you will soon see, becomes a key figure in this video and is mentioned quite frequently. I'm also going to refer to Leon Gaumont by his full name to avoid confusing him with his studio, which was called Gaumont, and vice versa. So, let's begin.
Have you ever heard of Alice Guy-Blaché?
I'm a filmmaker. I've never even heard about her.
No idea.
Never. I had actually heard of Alice Guy-Blaché.
I've never heard of Alice before.
I never even heard of her name.
No.
Yes, I had.
Never heard about her.
I've read a lot of books about movies and written a bunch of them and never heard her name.
I'd heard of her no, I'd never heard of her.
It's unbelievable to be a film director and as old as I am, and to be a woman, and I've never heard of her.
I'm floored
that we don't know about her.
I mean, I think people will think you're making it up.
I had never heard of Alice Guy-Blaché.
I don't know anything about her. Absolutely. I don't recall hearing about her.
I've never heard of Alice before.
I've never heard of a woman doing it.
No.
After the French Revolution, a lot of French people moved to South America to rebuild their fortune, and Emile Guy was no different. While living there, Emile had made friends with a married couple who had offered to help their niece Marie marry well. In Chile, Emile owned a chain of bookstores and had his own publishing company, and Marie's aunt and uncle thought they would be a good match. So in 1865, Marie left France, sailed to Chile, and married Emile. Marie and Emile had a number of children together, and all of their children had been born in Chile. When Marie fell pregnant with her 5th child, she sailed back to France so the baby would be, quote, properly French. And on July 1st, 1873, in St. Mandy, she gave birth to a baby girl named Alice Guy. It is also possible she wanted to give birth in France as she'd been having an affair with a Chilean man, which meant there was a possibility Emile might not have been the baby's father, and if he wasn't the father, then by giving birth in France, it meant it would be much easier for Marie to hide. A few months after giving birth, Marie took Guy to Switzerland and left her in her mother's care, and then returned to Chile. Then, 4 years later, Marie returned to Switzerland and took Guy back to Chile with her, where she lived with her parents for 2 years. When Guy was 6, her father took her to France, and once they arrived, he enrolled her into the Convent of Sacred Hearts along with her 3 sisters. But after her older brother died, Marie returned to France so the family could be together again. And shortly after, Guy's father died, and it was just Guy and her mother. Marie had lost her job, and a friend of theirs suggested Guy study typing and stenography, which at the time were new, so she did. Guy learnt very quickly, and her stenography teacher found her a temporary job at a varnishing factory. In her memoir, Guy talks about experiencing sexual harassment for the first time in this job. She was the only female working in the building, and a male colleague was inappropriate towards her, so she stood up for herself, and he complained to management and accused her of harassing him. Again, she stood up for herself against management, and after all of that, somehow, her and her harasser became friends. In March of 1895, Guy's stenography teacher told her about an available secretarial position at a company that produced still photography and optical equipment owned by Felix Richard. When she went to apply for the job, Richard was not there, but the second in command, Leon Gaumont, was, and he interviewed her for the position. This is one of my favourite parts of her memoir. She writes, quote, "The recommendation is excellent, but this post is important. I fear, mademoiselle, that you may be too young." All my hopes crumbled. "But sir," I pleaded, "I'll get over that." He looked at me again, amused. "Alas, that's true," he said. "You shall get over it." Well, let's try. And she got the job. There were some legal issues with Richard, and ultimately he had to retire from the business. He convinced Leon Gaumont the company was worth a lot more than what it actually was, and convinced him to buy the company from him for 50,000 francs. And on July 6, 1895, he did. And on August 10, 1895, Leon Gaumont's company was established, and Gaumont kept Guy on board. Before we go any further, it's important that we take a look at film itself. In Alison McMahan's book, Alice Guy-Blaché, Lost Visionary of Cinema, she mentions that at the time Guy started making films, there was a lot of controversy about what film was. She points out when Guy started working at Gaumont's still photography company, film as we now know it to be had not yet been invented. And when Guy began making films, there was a lot of controversy about what these moving images actually were and what their purpose would be. Would they be used for motion studies and sciences, or would they be used for aerodynamics, or was it an extension of still photography? In McMahan's book, she discusses in France we can look at the birth of cinema as a part of the industrial drive to mechanization. The technological development of cinema was in partnership with the development of flying machines, and some of the same inventors worked in both fields. She then goes on to detail tracing the birth of film itself. This is incredibly fascinating, and I'm going to summarize what she describes in detail the best I can, but just know the following information I'm about to share with you came from her book and is far more detailed in her book. In 1873, Pierre Janssen, an astronomer, gave a demonstration of his photographic rifle to the Academy of Sciences. Pierre Janssen spent 2 years working on a photographic device. This device was going to travel with him and a team to Japan in 1874 to document Venus passing across the face of the sun, an event that only happens twice in a century. His rifle was a success, and the images captured worked to prove a theory of his. The rifle was then used to photograph solar eclipses for many more years. A French photographer, more commonly known as Nader or Felix Nader, took up photography in the 1850s, and in 1857 he began hot air ballooning. He began taking his photography equipment in the hot air balloon with him, which at the time was actually quite common, and in her book McMahan notes that there are manuals that consist of pages of information about how to securely attach a camera to the basket. But as much as Nader loved doing this, he found it difficult to navigate, so he studied the motion of various flying objects and birds, and concluded that controlled aerial navigation required the flying body to be heavier than air. Nader and his colleagues created the Society for the Encouragement of Aerial Locomotion by means of machines heavier than air, with the intentions to bring together men with the ideas and the money to construct flying machines, specifically a helicopter. This ended up being unsuccessful as there was no money to do so. So Nader focused on his photography, and in 1887 he gave a demonstration of positive and negative photographic papers that were developed in 1884 by George Eastman and W.H. Walker. Tianju's Mary was a celebrated physiologist in Paris. He was dedicated to the study of human and animal locomotion with George Demny, his associate. Mary had attended Janssen's presentation in 1873 and was inspired. He then went on to develop a chronophotographic gun that had to wait for a few years for Janssen to give him his rifle, and then when he got it, he had to ask Janssen for permission to improve upon it, which he received. Mary also attended Nader's presentation in 1887, which massively influenced his work. In 1888, Mary presented his motion picture camera. However, the roll of paper was not perforated, so the images were not equidistant, which meant the camera he had developed was unreliable in capturing and projecting images. At the time, this didn't bother him, as his interest was solely in locomotion and not motion picture projection. Mary and Demny continued to produce motion pictures with the purpose of studying locomotion. Most of these films were of male athletes in the nude doing various athletic activities. But by May of 1892, Mary now wanted projection, so he began working on a projector, and by November of 1892, many of his colleagues felt the projector he had developed had resolved problems of projecting movement. But like his camera, the projector did not use a perforated film system, which meant steady movement was difficult to achieve. His associate, Demny, wanted to improve Mary's inventions and then commercialize them. By 1889, Demny was a lot more self-assured and no longer consulting with Mary regarding his work. Their relationship began to suffer, however Mary could see that Demny was coming into his own and encouraged him to publish his work and work on his own inventions, which he did. He produced a number of his own films and was even asked to give a theatrical demonstration of his films. Demny then developed his phonoscope, but this couldn't work on its own without Mary's chronophotography, and he couldn't market his phonoscenes without Mary's cooperation. At this point, the relationship between the two men was not good. Mary was upset with all of the press Demny had been receiving, and he was also disappointed with his own failure to commercialize the chronophotography, so he refused to cooperate. Demny then went on to create his own society to further exploit his invention and invited Mary, and Mary responded by firing him. These two men seemed to go back and forth for a while, trying to stop each other in commercializing their inventions, and Demny tries to work around Mary by moving into another field, the field of motion picture and projection. At first he approached the Lumiere brothers but was unsuccessful with them. Then he approached Leon Gaumont. Leon Gaumont consulted with his stakeholders, Gustave Eiffel and Joseph Vallet, and they approved, so Gaumont signed a contract with Demeny in August of 1895. Gaumont then purchased the rights to Demeny's patents for the phonoscope, which would then become the basis for Gaumont's 60mm camera, which was also called the chronophotography. Alice Guy was a witness to all of this. March 22nd, 1895, Leon Gaumont and Guy attended the Lumiere brothers' private presentation, in which they invited their closest friends and colleagues, and where they presented their new invention, the cinematography, their new camera. To demonstrate how their new camera worked, they screened their film, simply titled Workers Leaving the Lumiere Factory. Guy left this screening inspired and thought, quote, "One might do better than these demonstration films." Guy asked Leon Gaumont if she could make her own films, and he permitted it as long as it did not interfere with her secretary duties, and she agreed. In 1896, she released her first film, The Cabbage Patch Fairy. Throughout my research, I often read people crediting The Cabbage Patch Fairy as being the first fictional film. However, this is not true. Even Guy knew this, and at no point in her memoir does she claim to have made the first fictional film. And throughout her research, McMahan also found no evidence to support this. Quote, "In none of the correspondence I have read did Alice Guy claim to be the first director of a fiction film. Whenever that claim was made on her behalf, she was quick to point out that the Warded, the first fiction film made by the Lumiere brothers, came first." However, Guy did make one of the first fictional films with The Cabbage Patch Fairy in 1896. The film was based on a fairy tale about how babies were brought into the world, and it was a success. In fact, this film was so successful, Guy had to remake the film twice because each print had deteriorated due to use. The version that survived and is available today is one of her remakes. McMahan is positive this remake is the one filmed in 1899, and it is currently available on YouTube. After the success of her first film, in 1897, Leon Gaumont appointed Guy as the head of production at Gaumont Pictures at the age of 23. After a while, Gaumont notices Guy spends too much time travelling back and forth between her home and the studio, and arranges for her to move into a little house he owned behind the studio. It's while there, Guy filmed a number of her films in the foyer outside, and it was also there with her actors and Gaumont technical advisor, Frederic Delay, they discovered filmmaking techniques such as, quote, "Films turned into reverse, permitting one to take a house falling down and then reconstruct it as if by magic, a person falling from a roof and jumping up spontaneously, a greedy client at the bakery finding his bill too high, giving back intact the swallowed cakes. Films slowed down or accelerated by a turn of the handle, transforming peaceful passerby into creatures seized by frenzy or, on the contrary, sleepwalking. Stops, permitting one to displace an object which in projection would seem to be animated by a supernatural life, stupefying an archaeologist when his precious mummy plays in the laboratory. Double exposure, and fade-outs used for visions and dreams." At this time, Guy made a lot of comedies. In these films, she's making fun of the police or having fun with new sciences and magic. Often there is some kind of prank or trick involved either in the narrative or in the filmmaking technique. Some of my favourite films are The Sprinkler Sprinkled, At the Club, Turn of the Century Surgery, An Untimely Intrusion Intervention, How a Monsieur Takes His Bath, The Bricklayers, The Stepmother, A Stickly Woman, and Madam's Cravings. In 1906, Guy released The Birth, the Life, and the Death of Christ. This was her biggest production and her first and only epic film. She had her main cast, 300 or more extras. It was her biggest budget to date, and it is one of her longest films from this period, or at least it is her longest film from this time period that has survived. She also made a number of attraction films, which were films that were made purely to entice people to buy the camera the film was shot with. And if you brought the camera, typically you would get a copy of the film as well. Attraction films were common during this time, and often they lacked fictional narratives. They were about spectacle. Again, the purpose of an attraction film was to get people's attention, to sell the camera. During this time in the film industry, it was quite common for filmmakers to plagiarize each other's work, both intentionally and unintentionally. Guy herself copied other filmmakers, and other filmmakers copied her. Quote, "Competition was hard. We were protected by no laws. The extras employed indifferently by all studios serves as spies, which obliged us to race to finish first." Pathé, another French film company, copied a handful of Guy's films, some of which were almost shot-for-shot remakes. In Guy's films, she favoured her characters and their psychology, and in the films Pathé plagiarised, Pathé favoured drama and dramatic ending. The difference between Pathé and the Gaumont films seems to come from a desire on the part of the filmmakers, McMahan wrote. But her influence doesn't end there. Alan Williams credits Guy with creating the Gaumont house style, and for developing and training a team of filmmakers who would be, quite simply, the best in the business. She trained Etienne Arnaud and Louis Feuillade as writers and directors, Henry Menessier as a set designer, and Victorien Jesset as a director. Guy fired Jesset on the spot after a Gaumont extra accused him of sexually assaulting her. Jesset then went to Léon Gaumont, who upheld Guy's decision, and then Jesset spread lies and rumours that Guy only received and held her position at Gaumont Studios because she was Léon Gaumont's mistress. Jesset then went on to have a successful career at Eclipse Company and Eclair Studios. And just to set the record straight, because these rumours did persist, Guy was not a mistress to Léon Gaumont, or any man for that matter. For a number of years, D.W. Griffith was credited for being the first person to use close-up shots in his film after many years, which is not the case. This film has been lost, but based on detailed descriptions about the film that were written at the time, it seems unlikely this film uses close-up shots at all. And while Guy is one of the earliest filmmakers to have used a close-up shot, she is also not the first filmmaker to have used it. I tried searching for who used the close-up shot first, but I couldn't come to a definitive answer. Most of the sources I read had differing opinions, so what I will say is the first use of close-up shots still seems to be somewhat debatable, but it was not Alice Guy. Guy's first use of the close-up shot can be seen in Madam's Cravings, a 4-minute film about a pregnant woman stealing from other people to satisfy her cravings. Guy alternates between using long shots in which we see the pregnant woman stealing food and drinks from people on the street, and close-up shots in which we watch her consume the food and drinks, and all of which seem to be somewhat phallic-shaped. The use of close-up shots in Madam's Craving seems to, for some people, suggest fellatio, which for its time is quite brazen, and because of this, some people perceive the film to be rather erotic. This is also possibly one of the reasons why Madame's Cravings is rarely mentioned when discussing close-up shots and why shots from the film are rarely shown. McMahan writes, quote, "It is possible that the film was not well distributed, or perhaps the erotic content limited its possible venues. This might explain why the use of close-up shots in Madame's Cravings has so rarely been discussed." During this time, Leon Gaumont had developed the chronophone. The chronophone was a piece of equipment that would synchronize his cinematography with a disc called phonograph using a switchboard. The goal was to make sound films, more specifically talking films, and he was successful. In her memoir, Guy explained, "The songs and music were recorded in the studios on a cylinder of wax, and the recording would be played on set for the performers to lip sync and perform to." The chronophone was used to make phonoscenes, which is basically early cinema's version of music videos, and talking films, and Guy herself made more than 100 talking films.
Mais non, répond Rosinette, curieux que vous êtes, c'est très malhonnête. Qu'est-ce qui vous a pris? Le bruit qui vous a surpris hier dans ma chambrette. C'est mon chat, sur le coup de minuit, qui a mangé la souris. Mais dites-moi donc, Rosine, ma belle voisine, est-ce vrai ce qu'on dit sans façon dans toute la maison? On prétend que vous êtes ma chère très hospitalière, que le voisin d'en bas sûrement serait votre amant. Mais non, répond Rosinette, curieux que vous êtes, c'est très malhonnête, c'est vilain propos.
Leon Gaumont asked Guy to go to Spain to film a number of sound films using the chronophone, and along with her cameraman, she did. She writes about this trip in detail in her memoir, and she describes this trip as unforgettable. A number of these films have survived and are available on YouTube to watch. In her memoir, she writes that people look back at the films Gaumont made during this time and laugh at them. She then goes on to detail the process of processing their films, and I'm going to share that passage with you all because I think it's incredibly fascinating how much work was put into developing films at this time. Quote, "Our little films of 17 meters, then 25 meters were developed, fixed, dried by hand. Rolled on wooden frames, they were placed in vertical tanks containing the chemical baths of hydroquinone and metol, which an employee was then charged with agitating constantly to avoid that these salts resting on the film should make irregular zones of light. Too hot a bath would riddle the film with little holes. Often the film detached itself from the frame, like an onion skin, rendering a whole day's work useless. One had to be patient, begin again, preserve." Gaumont also produced coloured films, and quite a few of them, and every single one of their coloured films were coloured by hand. Quote, "Two workers installed at tables equipped for them. Jeweler's glass and eye would comb with fine brushes and transparent colours the images in which the actors were trivial. This early procedure was followed by that of cutting 3 ribbons to serve as stencils for mechanical coloration. This decoupage was made with the aid of a cutting pen and required the same care, the same dexterity as that earlier process." When Guy returned to Paris, she returned to the studio to work and met Guy-Blaché. Guy's usual cameraman was unwell, and Leon Gaumont saw this as the perfect opportunity for Blaché to learn how to use the Gaumont motion picture camera. Together they filmed Morelli, and during the shoot they fell in love. When the negative of the film was developed, it was discovered to be overexposed and full of scratches, and Blaché never shot a Gaumont film again. When the shoot ended, Guy did not expect to see Blaché again. Leon Gaumont sent him to Berlin to work as the manager of Gaumont's German office. He was to show the Germans how to use the chronophone. However, he wasn't very good at using it, and the Germans complained to Gaumont, and his solution was to send Guy to Berlin to accurately demonstrate the chronophone. Guy did not want to go. She could not speak or understand German, but Gaumont told her she will be going, and Blaché would act as her translator. By the end of this trip, Guy and Blaché were talking about getting married. They got engaged in 1906 on Christmas Day, and they married early 1907. Their sudden marriage was a big surprise to Léon Gaumont. In 1907 in London, Léon Gaumont gave a demonstration of the chronophone and had gotten the attention of various motion picture patents company members, and they gave him license to distribute the chronophone in the United States. Léon Gaumont had planned to send Blaché to America to establish a chronophone franchise and to get backing from American investors. Blaché's father was French, but Blaché himself was born and raised in England, so to Léon Gaumont, it made sense to send Blaché to America. Guy resigned from her position as head of production at Gaumont Studios to go to America with her new husband. But when Léon Gaumont sent Blaché and Guy to Cleveland, Guy was not employed and Blaché was not being sent as an official Gaumont employee, so neither of them were receiving a salary. When two American businessmen had brought the American rights to the Gaumont chronophone, Blaché worked with them more as the marketing partner with the focus on creating a franchise. And Guy worked with Blaché to help exploit the chronophone. However, after 9 months in Cleveland, their investors went bankrupt, and the money they had been living off of had run out. Around this time, Léon Gaumont had just finished constructing a new studio in Flushing, New York, and he had spent thousands of dollars converting it into a studio to produce chronophone films. So Blaché and Guy moved to New York, and Blaché asked Léon Gaumont for work. There is no evidence that Guy directed photo scenes at Gaumont's Flushing studio. We only know that she helped her husband market the chronophone in Cleveland because she wrote about it in her memoir. From 1908 to 1910, she was not working in the film industry or as a filmmaker at all. In 1908, she gave birth to their first child, Simone, and in 1912, she gave birth to their second child, Reginald. When she first arrived in New York, she was seemingly quite happy being a new mother and wife. But all of that changed in 1910. Gaumont had given up on the chronophone production in America, and the Flushing studio he had built a few years earlier had been left vacant. When Guy noticed it was no longer in use, her desire to return to filmmaking was ignited, and she sought out to rent the vacant studio. Quote, "The temptation was too strong. I resolved to rent it and try making a few films," she wrote. In October of 1910, Guy started her own company, Solax. She was in charge of film production, George A. Maggie was the business manager, and Blaché was the, quote, presiding spirit, and was still managing Léon Gaumont's American interests. Guy owned and ran the Solax production company and had over 50% of ownership of the entire physical plant, which included a film stage, a set construction shop, a film processing plant, and so on. She's the only woman to have owned her studio plant. Under Solax, she would produce silent films, which would then be distributed by Gaumont. Additionally, Solax films were sent to Paris, where they were developed, edited, and titled. Some film historians have falsely reported and claimed that Herbert Blaché and Léon Gaumont were not supportive, nor did they invest in Guy's company, which is not true. Blaché was absolutely supportive of his wife and her company, and the Gaumont studio, as I've already said, developed, edited, titled, and distributed her films. And while Léon Gaumont might not have financially invested in her company, it is possible she was able to start Solax because of the shares he might have bought from her. All of Gaumont employees had been a part of a profit-sharing program, which means Guy had shares in Gaumont. McMahan writes, quote, "Léon Gaumont must have bought Guy's Gaumont shares back from her, and it was from the sale of these shares that Guy came up with the $50,000 in startup funds for Solax." Additionally, the distribution arrangement between Solax and Gaumont Studio was hugely beneficial to Guy and Léon Gaumont. However, Léon Gaumont's arrangement and relationship with the Motion Picture Patents Company was not on good terms. He was never successful in joining the MPPC, had a falling out with a member of the MPPC, and when he became an independent producer, other independent producers were not kind to him. At this point, the Solax company, so far, had been quite successful, and as far as Leon Gaumont was concerned, the American branch of the Gaumont Studios should be just as successful as Solax, if not, then better. But it had not been doing well. Leon Gaumont felt Blaché had cheated him out of good business deals and blamed him for mismanaging the American branch. There is evidence to indicate that Leon Gaumont and Blaché had a falling out. However, Guy and Leon Gaumont remained on good terms and stayed in contact with each other even as they grew old. Guy directed the first few Solax films on her own, and over time she hired other directors and other employees as the company grew and expanded. During this time, her films were much longer. They are anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour and 10 minutes long. She makes a lot of comedies, but primarily focuses on dramatic films. She makes a number of military and cowboy films, and she makes the first film with an all-black cast. In her memoir, Guy claims to have been the only female director in the world for 17 years. Quote, "I passed for a phenomenon, as for 17 years I had been the only woman film director in the entire world." It is true she passed for a phenomenon. The American press constantly hounded her for interviews and media coverage, and if she couldn't do it, then the press would make up whatever stories they wanted. She talks about this in her memoir, and it's actually quite funny. But it is unlikely she was the only female director for 17 years. Based on various essays and novels I've read and the documentaries I've watched, it's more likely she was the only female director in the world for about 10 years, from 1896 to approximately 1906, possibly a few years later. As I've already mentioned, throughout her career she supervised other filmmakers, and she actually credits herself and her husband for giving Lois Weber her start in the film industry. Weber had been working as an actress and a gospel singer and had been hired by the American Gaumont chronophones to record songs for the chronophone so they could be used for the Gaumont phono scenes. When she began directing, she began doing so under Guy's supervision. Weber released her first film in 1911, thus making her the first female American director and, as far as we know, the second female director in the world. Weber directed films until 1934, but unfortunately her career, her fate, and her legacy is not too dissimilar to Guy's. Some scholars have concluded the downfall of Guy's career and Solax was because of her husband. However, Guy herself never makes this claim. In June of 1913, it was announced Herbert Blaché would be joining Solax. In her memoir, she wrote, quote, "My husband, having finished his contract with Gaumont, had taken the presidency of Solax. I abandoned the reins to him with pleasure. I never attended any of the conferences where the sales co-composed the programs. I would have embarrassed the men," said Herbert, who wanted to smoke their cigars and to spit at their ears while discussing business. Blaché's presidency at Solax only lasted for 3 months, from June to August of 1913. Gradually, Guy was losing all of the people who had helped her and worked for her, and film historians and scholars blamed Blaché for this. McMahan points out one of the major causes for Solax's downfall is the fact that by the middle of 1912, so before Blaché joined Solax, Solax lacked distribution for their films. Economically, things were very difficult. In a letter written by Guy, she mentions Solax was in financial trouble and the entire employees' body offered to take a 50% salary cut until the company got back on its feet, but it never did. Blaché actually tried to help Solax by creating a film distribution company of his own called the Film Supply Company of America. However, this ultimately ended up being too difficult for him to achieve success with, as he was juggling multiple jobs, including directing. On top of this, due to World War I, there was a coal shortage, which meant there was no light and no heat, which meant they weren't able to process their films and they weren't able to compete with bigger studios that had much more sophisticated plants to process their own films. By 1914, Solax had been absorbed into Blaché's company, Blaché Features, and Guy was listed as vice president. Blaché Features used the Solax plant, properties, and some employees. Guy and Blaché alternated directing every month and sometimes hired other directors to direct films they had produced. Then, in late 1914, Blaché started a third company called the US Amusement Corporation, which would also end up failing. Together, Guy and Blaché were trying to juggle 3 production companies, a studio, a film processing plant, trying to manage distribution for their own films, produce, direct films, and raise their 2 children. Blaché was desperate to maintain control of his and Guy's economic and artistic futures. He was so desperate he attempted vertical integration, something that even other studios like Pathé did not attempt to do. Moving on from this, Guy became a director for hire and was now being told what to make and how to make it. They tried to gain control of their situation but had no luck. Guy went on to make a number of successful films starring Olga Petrova and then a series of unsuccessful films. She also began having health problems that would unfortunately affect her for the rest of her life. Then, her husband ran off to California with one of his actresses he'd been having an affair with. When Guy finished shooting Her Great Adventure, she caught the Spanish influenza, which killed 4 of her colleagues. At this time, Blaché was in New York and he was horrified by the state of her professional life and her, quote, wasted appearance, and pitifully asked her to move to Los Angeles, California. And so, with her children, she did. While in Los Angeles, she worked as an assistant to Blaché on his directorial films. It isn't clear why she didn't try to make films in Hollywood. McMahan notes a possible reason is that her English was not very good and she preferred speaking in French at home and at work. Olga Petrova said that when she worked with Guy, she only spoke to her in French. While she was in LA, the Solax plant manager asked Guy to return to the studio. Blaché sublet the studio to a photographic company, and another company had set it on fire. The insurers were refusing to pay, creditors were beating down the door, and the company's assets were about to be seized. Blaché left Guy alone to deal with the bankruptcy proceedings. He did nothing to help or assist her. During her time in LA, she accepted their marriage was over, which caused her a great deal of heartbreak and devastation. She sued him for divorce and won minimal alimony. In her memoir, Guy never speaks ill of Blaché, and she doesn't blame him for the end of her company either. Moving on from this, from what I can tell, it doesn't seem like Blaché had much success. He continued to direct and produce films, although many sources I read said he was never really good at it. He didn't have the talent or the skills Guy possessed. When I looked for more information about Blaché and his career, especially his life after moving to LA, I couldn't find anything at all. All the information I found about him was about his life and career while he was with Guy. And we only know about this information because all of the work film historians and scholars have done to find out about Guy's life and career. But what I do know is he continued to direct films and released his final film in 1929 and died in 1953 at the age of 71. After the divorce was finalized, Guy moved back to France with her children. Twice she tried to get back into the film industry and had no luck both times. She didn't have any money to start her own company and people didn't want to employ an older woman, so she stopped trying. Her film career was over. Guy spent the remainder of her life living with her daughter Simone, and in 1964 they returned to the US. On March 24, 1968, Alice Guy-Blaché died in New Jersey. So, why was she forgotten? Well, it isn't so simple. McMahan points out that Leon Gaumont did not think film production was all that important. He was an inventor who worked with inventors and mentored inventors. When Leon Gaumont was nominated for the Legion of Honor Award in 1924, Guy was not invited. When Leon Gaumont accepted awards, he did not mention anyone who was employed at his film company, including Guy. He only acknowledged other inventors. Quote, "This oversight on his part seems to be more a reflection of his priorities, technical innovation over film production," McMahan writes. Because of this, she was barely mentioned in any of Gaumont's company's official documents, and she wasn't included in any of Gaumont's official documentation until the late 40s and early 50s, when Leon Gaumont's son Louis reached out to Guy asking for information about the company's history. Another major reason is that until 1912, films had no credits, meaning no credit scene, shot, or title card. None of her films say directed by Alice Guy or directed by Guy-Blaché. In her surviving films, these were added in at some point during the preservation process. Other filmmakers took credit for some of Guy's films. Victorian Jessett worked with Guy on the birth, the life, and the death of Christ as what we now call a second unit director. But for many years, Jessett claimed that this film was his, so for a long time, he received the credit for her film. During this time, it was also normal for film sets to be used again by other filmmakers, and sometimes they would be used to tell similar stories. Georges Heytaut made a film about the life and death of Jesus Christ, and used the same sets Guy used in her film about Christ. Because of this, their films were confused with one another, and Heytaut often received credit for her film, and Guy received, well, no credit at all. Later in her life, Guy confused Heytaut's film about Christ as her film, but Louis Gaumont confirmed it was Heytaut's film, and McMahan backs this up. Guy herself also reused a number of sets made for Heytaut's films, and McMahan hypothesizes Guy and Heytaut were aware of this and were in contact with one another, given how often they reused each other's sets. To complicate things further, Heytaut's film had a Gaumont catalogue number, so Louis Gaumont, being certain Heytaut's film belonged to Heytaut, means the Gaumont studio had been buying films from the Lumiere brothers for distribution. Therefore, the Gaumont film catalogue records is not accurate, or it is really easy to confuse films with one another, whether it was filmed in Gaumont studio or the Lumiere studio. So, identifying her films, yet alone finding her films, isn't easy. Another reason why is films at this time were filmed on nitrate film, which was flammable and caused fires, and fires did happen. The MGM Vault fire is a prime example of this. Then, during World War I, film stock was recycled to get the silver out of it so the silver could then be used for ammunition. Guy being wiped from film history was inevitable, and she was concerned about this. She often wrote to film historians to correct inaccurate statements about herself and her work. She also wrote lists of her films and hoped she would receive the recognition and credit she deserved. She tried to search for her films but didn't find a single one. When she died in 1968, to Alice Guy, it seemed that none of her films had survived. Her memoir was published in 1974 with the help of Anthony Slide, and it wasn't until then she began to receive the proper credit and recognition she deserved. Film historians Alison McMahan and filmmakers Pamela B. Green and Marquise Lee Page have also done a significant amount of work to uncover the life and work of Alice Guy and to find and restore her films.
Voir à la chandelle, je lui apprends le juif.